3 brutal Stoic rules that will make you stronger. Stoicism. Life lessons. You are tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. You are tired in a place that rest cannot reach, that deep, grinding exhaustion that comes from holding everything together for too long, from pretending that the cracks are not there, from waking up every morning already braced for the next thing that might break you. What if the way you have been living is making you weaker? Not weaker because life is too hard. Not weaker because you are not trying hard enough. Weaker because no one ever taught you the difference between strength and endurance, between carrying weight and being crushed by it. There is a version of you that wakes up without dread, that faces uncertainty without flinching, that looks at everything that cannot be controlled and chooses deliberately to redirect every ounce of energy back into what actually matters. That version of you is not a fantasy. It is you, operating from a different set of rules. 3 rules, to be exact. These rules were forged on battlefields, in prison cells, in the middle of plagues, in the private journals of men who had every reason to collapse and chose instead to think. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus. They were not distant theorists. They were people under real pressure. And what they discovered was something so precise, so ruthlessly practical, that it has survived 2,000 years without losing a single gram of its power. The Stoics did not promise a life without storms. They promised something far more valuable, a mind that no storm could own. And that promise is still available to you, right now. Not after you fix the relationship, or recover the money, or finally get the recognition you deserve. Right now, exactly as things are. 3 rules. Applied honestly, starting now. The war you were never supposed to win. Think about the last time you felt genuinely at peace, not distracted, not numb, actually at peace. For most people, that memory is either very distant or very brief. And the reason is not bad luck. The reason is that somewhere along the way, you enlisted in a war against uncertainty, against other people's behavior, against time, against loss, against the possibility that things will not go the way you need them to go. Here is the brutal truth, that war cannot be won. Not because you are not strong enough, but because the enemy is not real. You have been exhausting yourself, fighting shadows. Every morning, millions of people wake up and immediately begin calculating. What could go wrong? Who might disappoint them? What needs to be controlled, managed, anticipated? This mental machinery runs constantly at enormous cost. It consumes the energy that was meant for living and redirects it entirely toward defending, against outcomes that may never arrive, against people who are not even in the room. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Not comfort, not safety. Strength. He was not promising that things would get easier. He was identifying the precise location where all genuine human power lives. Not out there, in the management of circumstances. In here, in the governance of response. Epictetus, born a slave, could not control where he lived, what he ate, or whether he would ever be free. What he could control was the one thing his master could never reach, the quality of his own judgment. And he discovered, in conditions that would justify complete despair, that this single domain of control was not a consolation prize. It was the only prize that had ever mattered. The exhaustion you feel right now is not evidence of your failure. It is evidence of your misdirection. And misdirection can be corrected. Once you see where the real battle is being fought, everything changes. Not because the world becomes easier, but because you stop wasting yourself on a war that was never yours to fight. The anatomy of a cage, built from the inside. No one chooses suffering consciously. No one wakes up and decides to spend the day anxious and emotionally exhausted. And yet, for a significant portion of their lives, that is exactly what most people do. Not because they are broken, but because they have never been shown the precise mechanism by which the mind constructs its own confinement. The cage is real. The suffering is real. But the locks are always on the inside. When Epictetus's master broke his leg deliberately, Epictetus looked at him calmly and said, "You are going to break it." The leg broke. He said, "Did I not tell you?" This story is not told to celebrate pain tolerance. It reveals the architecture of inner freedom. Epictetus had drawn a precise boundary between what was happening to him and what he allowed that to mean about him. His body could be damaged, but the part that evaluated, judged, and decided what things meant, that part was untouchable. Most people have never drawn that boundary. Without it, every external event becomes a direct invasion of the self. Someone criticizes you, and your entire sense of worth collapses. A plan fails and your confidence disappears. This is not sensitivity. It is structural vulnerability, the result of a mind that has fused itself to outcomes it was never designed to control. Epictetus opens his discourses with the most fundamental distinction in Stoic philosophy. Some things are in our power, and others are not. In our power, opinion, motivation, desire, aversion. Not in our power, our body, our property, our reputation. If you apply this honestly to the contents of your own anxiety, something uncomfortable becomes visible. Most of what you are suffering over was never yours to own. The cage has no lock that requires a key from outside. It never did. The door opens from within, and the hand that opens it is always yours. The one thing that cannot be taken from you. There is a particular kind of despair that arrives not in moments of obvious catastrophe, but in the quiet aftermath of loss. After the relationship ends, after the career collapses, after the health changes in ways that cannot be reversed. In those moments, a terrifying question surfaces. If all of that is gone, what is left? The Stoics answered this with precision. What remains is your capacity to choose how you respond. That capacity is not a consolation. It is, according to Stoic philosophy, the only thing that was ever genuinely yours to begin with. Everything else, the reputation, the relationships, the body, the possessions, was always on loan, always subject to revision. But the faculty of judgment, the ability to look at circumstances and decide what they mean and how you will meet them, that was never on loan, and it cannot be repossessed. Seneca wrote, "The whole future lies in uncertainty. Live immediately, not after things stabilize, not once the grief has passed, immediately, in the middle of the uncertainty. Because waiting for better conditions before you begin governing your own mind is the exact trap that keeps people imprisoned indefinitely." Marcus Aurelius lost children. He was surrounded by betrayal. He carried responsibilities that no human being should carry alone. And in the middle of all of it, he wrote to himself one insistence again and again. Return to yourself. Whatever has happened, return to your values. Return to your judgment. Return to the one territory that no plague, no betrayal, and no loss can colonize. The thing that cannot be taken from you is not a small thing. It is not a last resort. It is the thing that makes everything else meaningful in the first place. Your capacity to be present, your capacity to choose, your capacity to decide in any moment, regardless of what surrounds you, what kind of person you are going to be right now. Not tomorrow. Right now. Exactly as things are. With everything that is broken still broken. That capacity is yours. It always has been. The Philosopher's Mirror. Seeing yourself without illusion. There is a courage that has nothing to do with facing enemies or enduring hardship. It is quieter, and in many ways, more demanding than anything that happens on a battlefield. It is the courage to look at yourself honestly, to hold up the mirror without tilting it, without softening what it reflects. The Stoics considered this foundational, not because self-knowledge is pleasant, but because everything else depends on it. You cannot govern a territory you have not accurately mapped. And most people spend their lives governing an imaginary version of themselves, while the real one continues to make the same decisions and repeat the same patterns. Seneca wrote that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. The greatest waste is a life spent in shallow relationship with your own interior, moving fast enough that you never have to see what is actually driving you, until the moment arrives, and it always arrives, when the consequences of your unexamined patterns become impossible to ignore. Marcus Aurelius did not write the Meditations as a philosophical treatise. He wrote them as a daily practice of honest self-confrontation, a record of the places where his behavior fell short of his values, where he had been irritable when he intended to be patient, where he had sought praise when he intended to be indifferent to it. The writing was not confession, it was calibration, the daily act of measuring the actual self against the intended self. The mirror reveals not just your flaws, but the specific structure of your self-deception, the particular shapes your avoidance takes, the precise language your mind uses to justify the things it wants to do, while performing the vocabulary of the things it claims to value. Every person has this private glossary of rationalizations that sounds, from the inside, remarkably like wisdom. Look into the mirror, not to condemn what you find, to know it, to map it. The person who looks honestly enough eventually becomes someone whose reflection requires less correction, not because the standard drops, because the person rises to meet it. The tyranny of opinion, why you are not what others think of you. There is a prison that requires no walls, no guards, no locks. It is constructed entirely from the opinions of other people and your relationship to them. Most people live inside it without ever recognizing it as a prison at all. Marcus Aurelius, a man whose opinion shaped the lives of millions, wrote in private about the meaninglessness of reputation and the trap of seeking validation. He wrote that it is impossible to live happily while worrying about what others think of you. Not difficult, impossible. And he knew this not as abstract philosophy, but as lived experience. Epictetus made the distinction that clarifies everything. Reputation, what other people conclude about you, is emphatically not up to you. You can influence it. But the final verdict is assembled inside other people's minds, filtered through their histories, insecurities, agendas, and limited information. You have no jurisdiction there. And to build your sense of self on ground you have no jurisdiction over is to build on something that can shift without warning. Consider what this dependency actually costs. Every time you edit what you say because of how it might be received, attention spent. Every time you replay a conversation searching for evidence of how you were perceived, attention spent. Every time you perform a version of yourself calibrated to whoever is watching, energy spent. Hours of your finite life routed away from what is genuinely yours. The Stoics called this the tyranny of opinion, and the word tyranny is exact. A tyrant exercises power over your life from outside your own will. If your peace depends on the approval of people around you, those people are exercising a tyrant's power over the most intimate dimensions of your existence. Not because they are malicious, simply because you handed them that power. There is a freedom on the other side of this that is difficult to describe. It is the freedom of the person who does what is right because it is right, not because it will be recognized. Who speaks honestly because honesty is their value. Who remains consistent in private and in public not because they are performing consistency, but because there is no gap between the two. That territory is waiting for you. The only question is whether you are ready to take it back. The discipline of desire, wanting what is already yours. There is a form of suffering that requires no external cause, no loss, no failure, no cruelty from another person. It is manufactured entirely from the inside, assembled by the mechanism of wanting what you do not have and attaching your peace to getting it. The Stoics identified this mechanism early because a person who has not examined their desires is not a free person. They are being pulled in directions they did not choose, toward destinations they were not consulted about. Epictetus placed the discipline of desire at the center of Stoic practice, not because desire itself is the enemy. What he pointed at is more precise: the destructive habit of placing your well-being in conditional territory, of saying implicitly that your peace is contingent on an outcome. The world does not organize itself around your conditions, and the person waiting for the right circumstances before they allow themselves to be at peace will wait indefinitely. Marcus Aurelius observed that very little is actually needed for a happy life, and that the happiness lies in recognizing what that little is, and understanding that you already possess the most essential elements. He was not speaking as someone lacking material abundance. He was speaking as the most powerful man in the known world, who had noticed that none of those resources had solved the fundamental problem. The problem was never the absence of the thing desired. It was the structure of the desiring itself. Every commercial architecture of modern life is designed to produce in you one specific sensation, that you are not quite complete, that there is something missing, that the next acquisition, the next achievement, will finally make things right. A person who has genuinely internalized the Stoic discipline of desire is, in a very specific sense, useless to those systems. They are not available for the transaction. They have already found what the transaction was pretending to offer. The Stoic does not stop wanting. They want differently. They want with their eyes open, and they have made the foundational decision, radical in its simplicity, difficult in its execution, that their peace does not wait for the wanting to be satisfied. It was always closer than the next thing you were waiting for. The art of voluntary hardship, training the self before life forces it. There is a difference between the person who endures difficulty because it arrived uninvited and the person who seeks difficulty before it arrives. The first is being tested by circumstances. The second is testing themselves by choice. That choice, the deliberate movement toward hardship before it becomes mandatory, is one of the most consequential decisions a human being can make about the architecture of their own character. The Stoics practiced this systematically. Seneca, who was wealthy by any measure, would periodically live for days as if he had nothing. Simple food, rough clothing, minimal shelter, not as punishment, but as calibration. He wanted to verify that comfort had not secretly become a dependency. He wanted to confirm that if the comfort disappeared, as it always can, he would not be meeting that moment for the first time. This is the key insight that separates Stoic hardship practice from mere self-punishment. It is about maintaining a practiced familiarity with your own resilience, about ensuring that the version of you who exists only when conditions are favorable is not the only version that exists, because life, with absolute certainty, will eventually present the other conditions. The person who has never practiced anything hard is not a person who will be spared from hardship. They are a person who will be destroyed by it when it comes. Tolerance for hardship is not a fixed trait. It is trainable. Every time you choose the harder path when the easier one is available, you recalibrate what your system registers as hard. The discomfort that would have been destabilizing at the beginning of the practice becomes, over time, simply the texture of effort, not necessarily pleasant, but not catastrophic. This recalibration transfers. The person who trains discomfort in one domain builds the meta-capacity of choosing difficulty over ease, and that transfers everywhere. Voluntary hardship also strips away the illusions that comfort builds. When you live only in ease, it is possible to maintain elaborate fictions about what you would do if things got genuinely hard. Voluntary hardship dissolves those fictions efficiently. It shows you, quickly and without sentiment, the distance between the person you narrate yourself as and the person you currently are. Life will make its demands. The only question worth asking now is whether you want to meet those demands as someone who has been preparing, or as someone encountering resistance for the first time with no prior relationship to it. The time to choose is before the hardship arrives. The present moment is home, returning to what is real. There is a location that is always available and almost never inhabited. It requires no travel, no resources, no permission. The Stoics called it the present moment, not as a spiritual abstraction but as the only place where life actually occurs. Everything else, the past you carry as grievance, the future you carry as anxiety, these are mental constructions. Your actual life is happening here, now, and the degree to which you are present to it is the degree to which you are actually living. Marcus Aurelius fought for the present moment daily, against a mind just as prone to drift and rumination as any other. He wrote that each day must be enough in itself, that you have only ever this breath, this action, this encounter. He wrote this not to comfort himself, but to correct himself, to drag his attention back to the only place where something could actually be done. The mind is not naturally present. It moves without invitation into the past, replaying what was said, what was lost, what should have gone differently. It moves into the future, projecting what might happen, what could go wrong, what needs to be secured. Both movements feel like necessary activity, like due diligence. But the vast majority of mental time spent in the past or future is not productive reflection. It is compulsive repetition. The mind running the same loops, producing the same feelings, arriving at no new conclusions, while the present moments pass unconsumed. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. The disasters we anticipate with such meticulous mental effort rarely arrive in the form we imagined. And when actual difficulty does arrive, the mind trained to meet the present handles it more effectively than the mind exhausted by anticipating it. The practice is simpler to describe than to execute, not the anxious, self-conscious attention of someone trying hard to be present as a performance. The genuine article is quieter. It is the attention that notices without commentary what is actually here, the texture of this moment, the actual content of this conversation, without the overlay of what it reminds you of or what it might lead to. Every hour spent in dread of a future that has not arrived is an hour not spent in the present where you actually have agency, where you can actually do something, where life is actually happening. Come back. Not to a perfect moment, to the real one. The obstacle is the way, turning resistance into fuel. The phrase sounds like optimism. It is not. It is something more structural and more demanding than optimism. The Stoics did not teach that obstacles are secretly good or that difficulty should be reframed into positivity. They taught something more radical, that the obstacle is not separate from the path. It is the path, that the resistance you encounter is not interrupting your progress. It is the material from which progress is made. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This is not a motivational slogan. It is a precise description of how character develops. The person who only acts in smooth conditions never actually builds the capacity to act. They build the capacity to move when movement is easy, which is a capacity of limited value in a world that is not consistently smooth. Every difficulty contains within it a specific invitation. The invitation to practice precisely the virtue that the difficulty is testing. The situation that makes patience difficult is the situation in which patience can actually be developed. The circumstance that makes honesty costly is the circumstance in which honesty means something. The relationship that requires genuine effort is the relationship in which genuine love can be expressed. Remove the obstacles and you remove the opportunities. The easy version of every virtue is not the virtue. It is a rehearsal for conditions that may never arrive. Epictetus taught his students to stop asking why this is happening to me and start asking what this is asking of me. Not as resignation, as reorientation. The question why is aimed at a cause that cannot be changed. The question what is aimed at a response that can be chosen. And the choice of response, in the moment when the obstacle is present and the pressure is real, is the moment when character is not merely performed but actually formed. The Stoic approach to obstacles is not passive. It is not the acceptance of defeat dressed up in philosophical language. It is the aggressive redirection of energy from resistance to engagement, from fighting the existence of the difficulty to extracting from it whatever it has to offer. The person who moves through obstacles this way does not become someone for whom life is easier. They become someone for whom life's difficulty stops being a reason to stop. Death as a teacher, the practice of memento mori. The Stoics thought about death every day, not with morbidity, not with fear, with the precise clarifying attention of people who understood that the awareness of finitude is not a reason for despair. It is the most reliable instrument for living with genuine intention. Memento mori. Remember that you will die. This was not a threat. It was a tool. a daily practice of situating your choices within the actual context of your life, a context that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and in which time is not an unlimited resource to be spent carelessly. The person who forgets they will die behaves differently than the person who remembers. They defer more, they tolerate more, they invest more of their attention in things that do not matter, because the urgency that would redirect that attention has been suppressed. Seneca returned to this theme with urgency that reads less like philosophy and more like shaking someone awake. He wrote that we act as though we have unlimited time, as though the moment of reckoning is far enough away that today's compromises are affordable. He called this the fundamental self-deception, not that people want to waste their lives, but that they do not feel, in the ordinary texture of their days, the weight of the fact that the days are numbered. Marcus Aurelius used a specific practice to break through this numbness. He would think of all the emperors, generals, and philosophers who came before him, people who had seemed essential to their time, whose urgencies had felt permanent, and who were now entirely forgotten, not diminished, forgotten. The empire itself had barely registered their passing, and if that was true of them, he asked himself, what exactly justified his own attachment to reputation, to recognition, to the outcome of any particular struggle? The practice of mortality did not make him nihilistic. It made him precise. It stripped away the noise and returned his attention to what actually mattered within the time he actually had. What would you do differently if you knew you had 5 years left? Most people, when asked this question honestly, name things they are not currently doing, relationships they are not investing in, work they are not pursuing, experiences they are deferring. The values they would suddenly prioritize are, in most cases, the values they already hold. They are simply not governing their choices because the urgency required to activate them has been temporarily suppressed by the comfortable fiction of unlimited time. Memento mori does not suppress that fiction permanently. It erodes it, daily, in proportion to the honesty with which the practice is applied. It returns to every ordinary moment the quality of attention that moment actually deserves. Not drama, not anxiety, presence. The presence of someone who knows that this, right here, right now, is not the rehearsal. The community of reason, Stoicism, and the bonds between people. There is a misunderstanding about Stoicism that is common enough to require direct address. The misunderstanding is that the Stoic ideal is the self-sufficient individual, someone who has so thoroughly internalized their independence from external circumstances that other people become unnecessary. The cold philosopher in the tower, impervious, alone, complete. This is not Stoicism. It is a caricature of it, and the Stoics themselves were explicit about the distinction. Marcus Aurelius wrote that he was born for others, not as sacrifice, not as obligation, as the basic expression of what it means to be a human being, a rational, social animal whose full development cannot occur in isolation from the community of which they are a part. The inner citadel, the cultivated independence from external circumstance, was not built to enable withdrawal. It was built to enable genuine contribution, to ensure that the person showing up to serve the common good was showing up from a place of sufficiency rather than need, from strength rather than depletion. The Stoics believed in what they called the cosmopolis, the city of the world, the community of all rational beings, extending beyond the boundaries of any particular nation or tribe. Every person you encounter, regardless of their origin, their status, their behavior, participates in the same rational nature that you participate in. This is not a sentiment. It is a philosophical claim with practical consequences. It means that your obligations extend further than your preferences, that the irritating colleague, the stranger in difficulty, the person whose views you find incomprehensible, these are not outside the circle of your concern. They are inside it. Because rationality, the Stoics insisted, is not a personal possession. It is a shared inheritance. This does not mean that all relationships are equal, or that all behavior is to be accepted without response. The Stoics were not naive about human difficulty. Marcus Aurelius spent decades navigating a court full of people who were manipulative, dishonest, and self-serving. He responded not with bitterness but with a patience grounded in understanding. These people are mistaken, not evil. They are doing what people do when they have not examined their own minds. The appropriate response is neither condemnation nor capitulation. It is the maintenance of your own standards in the face of their confusion. What the Stoics ultimately understood about human connection is this: the quality of your relationships is a direct reflection of the quality of your inner work. The person who has not yet examined their own needs, fears, and patterns will inevitably project those things onto everyone they are close to. They will ask their relationships to carry weights those relationships were not designed to bear. The person who has done the work, who knows their own interior with some honesty, can meet other people as they actually are, rather than as extensions of their own unresolved interior. That is the precondition for genuine connection. Not the absence of need, the honest knowledge of where your needs lie and where they can legitimately be met. Living according to nature. The Stoic vision of the good life. There is a phrase at the center of Stoic ethics that has been misunderstood so consistently that it requires careful unpacking. The phrase is live according to nature. And the almost universal misunderstanding is to interpret it romantically, as an instruction to simplify, to retreat, to seek a pastoral existence closer to the earth. The Stoics meant something almost exactly opposite. When they spoke of nature, they meant it in two connected senses. First, the nature of the cosmos, the rational order structuring reality, the logos moving through all things, expressing itself in the patterns of cause and effect, and the interdependence of all life. To live according to nature in this sense was to stop fighting against the structure of reality and start working within it. The second sense was more personal. It was the nature of a human being specifically, the rational, social animal. To live according to your nature is to live in full expression of what is distinctively human. The Stoics identified this as reason and virtue, not one value among others, but the organizing principle of the good life. Not because virtue is pleasant, it is often the opposite, but because virtue is the full expression of rational human nature in action. The good life in the Stoic vision produces what they called eudaimonia, sometimes translated as happiness, but more accurately understood as flourishing. This quality of well-being is not available through wealth, pleasure, fame, or power. These are preferred indifference, reasonable to pursue when available, but carrying no inherent value. The good life is constituted by the quality of the human being doing the living. Marcus Aurelius carried the weight of empire and wrote in his private notebooks that he wanted only one thing: to be a good person. Not a celebrated figure in history. A good person. Someone who thought clearly, acted justly, and directed the full force of his rational nature toward what actually mattered. A slave among, as Epictetus demonstrated, could be stripped of every external advantage and still succeed at it completely. Because the project is interior. It is the project of becoming, through practice and attention and daily commitment, the kind of human being that the human being is capable of being. The practice of Stoicism. From philosophy to daily life. There is a gap that exists in almost every serious encounter with philosophy, the gap between understanding and living. A person can read every Stoic text, articulate every doctrine with fluency, and still wake up the next morning reactive, distracted, governed by fears they know to be irrational. The understanding did not fail. The translation failed. The movement from page to life is not automatic. It requires what the Stoics were explicit about and what is easy to underestimate: practice. The morning was a time for preparation. Before the day's demands arrived, Marcus Aurelius would remind himself that he would encounter people who were difficult, ungrateful, dishonest, self-absorbed, and that this was not a reason for cynicism, but for the renewal of his own commitment. The morning practice is not magic. It is the establishment of a direction. A decision made before the friction of the day creates the conditions for forgetting about who you intend to be. The evening was a time for review. Seneca examined each day before sleep, not as self-punishment but as honest accounting. What was consistent with my values? What was not? Where was I reactive when I could have been considered? This examination is designed not to produce guilt, but information. Accurate data about the gap between intentions and behavior. The raw material of genuine change. Throughout the day, the Stoics practiced the pause, the deliberate interruption of the automatic response. When something produced a strong reaction, the practice was to insert a space between the event and the response, to notice the impulse before acting on it, to ask, is this response mine, or is it a conditioned habit? The capacity to pause develops with practice. The first pause is difficult, the 100th is less so. There is also the practice of perspective, what the Stoics called the view from above. In moments of distress, they would deliberately expand their field of view, situate the troubling thing within the larger context of their life, then history, then the cosmos, not to make the thing seem trivial, but to restore proportion. Marcus Aurelius practiced this by thinking of all the emperors before him, who had faced comparable crises and were now entirely forgotten. The practice restores what distress reliably removes, the capacity to see clearly. None of this is complicated. All of it is difficult. The difficulty is not in understanding what to do. It is in doing it, consistently and perfectly, without expecting arrival at some final state of mastery, but with the sustained commitment to showing up to the practice again today. Stoicism and relationships. The art of loving without losing yourself. There is a tension at the heart of the Stoic approach to relationships that is easy to misread. The Stoics insisted that virtue is the only genuine good, that external circumstances cannot be the foundation of well-being. Read without care, this sounds like a prescription for emotional distance, like a philosophical justification for keeping people at arm's length. This reading is wrong, and the Stoics were explicit about why. Epictetus, who had been a slave, who had known what it meant to have no legal claim to his own body, taught that the social dimension of human nature is not incidental to the good life, but constitutive of it. The person who retreats from genuine connection in the name of self-protection has not achieved Stoic equanimity. They have achieved something smaller and colder that mistakes the absence of vulnerability for the presence of strength. The Stoic ideal in relationships is not detachment. It is engaged non-attachment, full presence without desperate clinging, genuine love without the distortion that fear of loss produces. Fear of loss does something specific and damaging. It turns the other person into a function, into a source of something you need, security, validation, identity, rather than a complete human being who deserves to be seen on their own terms. The person who loves from a place of scarcity cannot actually see the person they are with. They see a mirror. They see the shape of their own need reflected back, and they call it love. The Stoics understood this with remarkable psychological precision. The quality of a relationship is directly connected to the degree to which each person has done the interior work, of grounding their well-being in their own character rather than in the other person's continued behavior. This does not mean that loss does not hurt. When Epictetus taught his students to say, "I am kissing a mortal" when embracing someone they loved, he was not teaching them to feel less. He was teaching them to feel more accurately, to be present with the full reality of what they were holding, including its impermanence. The grief that follows genuine loss is not a sign that the Stoic practice failed. It is a sign that the love was real. To love well in the Stoic sense is to love from fullness rather than from emptiness, to bring a complete person to the relationship rather than a person who needs the relationship to complete them, to hold the other with care and without grasping. This is not a diminished form of love. It is love at its most honest and most durable. The Unfinished Philosopher. Stoicism as a way of life, not a destination. There is a temptation, at the end of any serious engagement with philosophy, to look for the conclusion, for the moment when the ideas crystallize into a final insight that delivers you from the ongoing difficulty of the practice into some stable state of achieved wisdom. The Stoics understood this temptation, and they refused it, not because they were being coy, but because they understood something about the nature of the project that makes the temptation itself a form of misunderstanding. There is no destination. There is only the practice and the person the practice is making, and the day in front of you in which the practice either happens or it does not. Epictetus told his students that the person who announces they have mastered philosophy has misunderstood what philosophy is. It is not a body of knowledge to be acquired and possessed. It is a way of engaging with experience, a continuous, never-completed orientation toward the question of how to live. The Stoic sage was a theoretical ideal that the Stoics themselves acknowledged was more compass than destination. A direction of travel, a standard against which to measure not how inadequate you are, but which way to walk. Marcus Aurelius wrote about his failures with the matter-of-fact honesty of a craftsman who knows that the standard is not the enemy of the practitioner. It is the thing that makes the practice meaningful. Without the gap between where you are and where you could be, there is no practice. There is only the comfortable fiction of arrival. Seneca wrote, near the end of his life, that he was still learning, that he wrote not from the position of someone who had arrived, but as a fellow traveler slightly further along the same path. This quality of honesty, the refusal to perform a wisdom he had not fully achieved, is what makes the Stoic writings still alive after 2,000 years. They are not the pronouncements of people who finished the work. They are the notes of people who are doing the work and know it will not be finished in their lifetimes. What does it mean practically to treat Stoicism as a way of life? It means releasing the expectation of consistency. The person committed to this practice will have days of unusual clarity and days of humiliating regression. They will hold impermanence lightly on some mornings and cling to what they fear losing on others. None of this is evidence that the practice is not working. All of it is the practice, the return, the choice made again after every lapse to recommit, is not a secondary feature of the Stoic life. It is the central feature. The inner citadel is not built so you can live inside it. It is built so you can go out, into the complexity and the difficulty and the beauty and the loss of being alive among other people, with something stable at your center, with the capacity to be moved without being swept away, to love without grasping, to act without attachment to outcome, to face what cannot be changed without bitterness, and to change what can be changed with the full force of a character that has been deliberately, patiently, imperfectly built. The Stoics did not promise a life without suffering. They promised a life in which suffering does not have the final word. They did not promise a self that never wavers. They promised a self that always returns. They did not promise arrival. They promised that the walking itself, the daily, imperfect, never-finished practice of trying to live well, is the thing. That the trying is not a consolation prize for failing to arrive. It is the whole of it. It is enough. You are, right now, in the only moment that the practice can happen, not tomorrow, not when you have read more or failed less. Now, in whatever situation you find yourself, with whatever you have. The Stoics have been walking this path for more than 2,000 years. There is room for one more. Thank you for watching. If these ideas found something real in you, the next step is simple. Pick one practice from today and apply it tomorrow morning. Not all 15. One. That is how it starts. That is how it always starts.